It is good to be in the house of the Lord today, is it not? It is good to sing unto our God of His greatness and all of what He has done for us. It is good to be here today, and thank you for joining us in worship this morning. As you know, I spend a lot of time here in this place. Maybe you don't know that. Maybe you're not aware of that. But I'm one of those types that believes that if you're going to pay me a salary, I ought to be in the church. So I'm here Monday through Friday, and of course on Sunday as well. And so I spend a lot of time here. And the church has a phone number listed on the website, although there's no actual phone system in this building. It's just a virtual number, and it forwards to my cell phone in my pocket. So if you ever call the church number, you immediately get me, which surprises some people at times, because they'll call and they'll go, "You're the pastor?" Yeah, you got me directly. "Oh, no secretary?" No secretary. But the reason I point that out is because I get regularly calls from people to the church, to that number, who will ask if the church helps with various financial needs. Almost every week, without fail, I will get a call from somebody who will ask me if we pay utility bills, or if we put up people in hotels for a night, that sort of thing. It's a regular thing. And what's interesting is that the story I get is typically the same each time. So there must be a script out there of some sort that is being used, but they call the church. And I've often wanted, I've never had the guts to do so, but I've often wanted to have a conversation with the person on the other end of why they're calling the church. Why would you call us? I mean, after all, it's highly unlikely you'd ever actually come to the church. I mean, the people that call are never here, never seen one. So why would you call a church? Now, I know the reason I don't ask is I really do know the answer to the question, right? I mean, why do people call churches looking for handouts? And the answer is because they know that the church is often helpful to others. Churches are generous in what they have, and they give, and so there's a sense in which if I have a need, I'll call a local church. That seems to be the obvious thing. And the implication, of course, is that the church is supposed to be a place that is generous and helpful, right? The implication is that we are supposed to be a place that's generous and helpful, even in financial matters. And so people will call a church because they'll say, I suspect that's what you're supposed to be. You are, by definition, supposed to be benevolent. Benevolent. You know that word, right? It means being well-meaning and kind, being good to others, being generous, and so forth. I mean, churches, by definition, are to be benevolent. And benevolence is, I would argue, is an essential part of what it means to be a church. In fact, we as Christians are to be generous as a part of what it means to be a member of the family of God. It's a part of the very nature of who we should be. It should be a part of our DNA in the sense that if we have received a great gift from God, then we should be willing to be generous to others as well. That should be a part of who we are, especially those who are less fortunate than us or vulnerable or whatever. Now, I realize that many of these people will call a church looking for a handout not because they want to be a part of the family, but simply looking for the handout. But that doesn't imply, just because there are those who think that way, that we shouldn't be pursuing a sense of compassion and help and generosity towards others. We should be thinking in that way. Those comments are designed to lead you to where we're going this morning in 1 Timothy 5. Because Paul understands this idea. He understands this idea of benevolence. And as we turn into this new chapter, he is going to begin thinking about this, or begin talking about this idea in terms of what it means to be a New Testament church. Benevolence. Now, let me remind you of what's going on here. In chapter 5, Paul is pivoting to more practical matters from this point onward. He's here going to address the various issues that are going to arise by virtue of Timothy doing his job. Remember back in chapter 4, what was the primary idea? Timothy, do your job. Okay, if Timothy does his job, then there's going to be some results of that. And as we looked at last week, there's going to be some conflict that will necessarily arise. This is why Paul says, do not rebuke an older man. There's going to come a situation where you're going to have to address somebody in the midst of doing your job. You're going to have to talk to somebody, but do so in a way in which you recognize that this is a family relationship. That you are a son or a daughter or a brother or a sister, and you are to address others in the church along that line. Think about how you address others in this way. So in essence, what he is doing is, as the NIV puts it in verse 4, how to put religion into practice. How to put religion or spiritual concepts or spiritual thoughts or spiritual actions into practice. How to live as a part of a family. How to approach others and treat them as members of a family. Because Paul, as I argued last week, sees the church as a family. An extended family of fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters, all related to one another in our adoption in Christ Jesus. So Paul addresses first the reality of conflict that arises when you need to deal with somebody in the church who's wandered off into error. There will be people who will wander off into error. That was obvious at the beginning of chapter 4. Now that's going to continue in that thought. So Paul starts there with Timothy, but now Paul addresses another kind of conflict. Another kind of conflict. I call it a direct type of conflict that seems to have been common in the early church. A type of conflict that apparently characterized most of the New Testament church. The issue of benevolence, particularly for the most vulnerable in the family life of the church. Now let me just stop here and tell you what Paul's going to do to Timothy here. Paul is going to directly address the issue of benevolence in the life of the church, where Paul will put forth a policy to follow within a larger world view of the church. In other words, Paul's going to address the subject, establish a policy, but the policy is within a larger framework, a larger worldview, a larger understanding that he expects the church to have. All right, so that's what we're going to try to unpack this morning from chapter 5, starting in verse 3. And yes, we're going to go all the way down to verse 16. In verse 3, Paul tells us who he's talking about. Okay, so he's giving to us here those that belong to the issue at hand. And he uses the term widows. Honor widows who are truly widows. Okay, and we all know what a widow is, right? A widow is a woman who's lost her husband in death. That's what a widow is. A widow is a woman who has lost her husband in death. And in the first century, a woman who has lost her husband in death and now finds herself in a financially vulnerable state. That's key here. In the patriarchal/agrarian society of the first century, widows were amongst the most vulnerable. Widows were amongst the most vulnerable because of their absolute reliance upon their husband for their financial support, who's now gone. In death, their widow's financial support has been taken out from underneath them, literally. And so they are the most vulnerable in society. And so it would appear that the needs of widows is one of the most common issues of the early church. In fact, widows are mentioned in a number of specific places in the New Testament to demonstrate this sense of vulnerability that they have. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus, starting in verse 38, sits at the temple and watches the widow who throws in everything that she has into the temple coffers. And he compares her generosity to the lack thereof or religiousness of the Jewish leadership standing around. Jesus uses a widow here as an example. In Acts chapter 6, you have the establishment of deacons. The actual office of deacons is established as the widows of the very early church are struggling in different classes. The Greek The Greek widows are being taken care of less than the Jewish widows at the time, and so there arose a conflict, and the apostles said, establish some deacons who can handle this so that we can focus our attention on preaching and teaching, and so some men were brought forward for that. Again, notice it's a widow's problem. In James chapter 1, James defines pure religion, or dare I say spirituality and practice, as taking care of widows and orphans. Again, notice widows at the top of the list. What's pure religion? Taking care of the most vulnerable, widows and orphans. And here in 1 Timothy 5, we see the widow's needs again in the church at Ephesus. In this particular case, Paul's going to deal with it by policy. He's actually going to establish a policy over this particular issue. But verse 3 has an interesting question in it. It's one of those verses you ought not to just read by too quickly because it says something very odd. If you pay close attention, what does it say? It says, honor widows who are truly widows. Wait a minute, I thought the definition of a widow was someone who just lost their husband. You're either a widow or you're not. One would think, but not according to the Apostle Paul. All right? He sees something here. Why aren't all such women widows by definition? What's the distinction here? What's the distinction between the widow and the truly widow? How do you get into the truly widow category? Multiple husbands that die? No. The context gives us the answer to the question. All right? As we continue down the page, Paul will give us the context which will define what he means by the widow versus the true widow. So widows, in this case, is a specific subset of such women who qualify for benevolence from the church. By implication, this verse tells us not all will qualify. Not all will qualify, which is exactly why this is such a phrase of policy statement, right? You establish a policy for the purpose of deciding who and who not, right? By the way, GFBC has in fact established a benevolence policy. We have a policy related to benevolence and how we deal with these kinds of questions that I raised a moment ago of people who called the church. We have a specific policy in place for dealing with it. You can find it on our website. If you go to the ministries link there and click the little scroll down and you can pick benevolence and you can read the policy. It's right there online. And I would encourage you to do so. In fact, many of the qualifications that are listed in that policy come almost directly out of this passage of Scripture here. Many of the ideas upon which it's built come from here. So, Paul is going to be addressing widows, but specific kinds of widows in his policy. Now, Paul is going to give us then the qualification of who is, in fact, to receive this benevolence amongst the widows. He establishes the general qualification that applies in this policy, and it's in verse 4. Verse 4, Paul says, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them, that is the children or grandchildren, first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. Okay, so Paul speaks here of women who have grandchildren or children. And a woman who is a widow, Paul says, is to be taking care of them firstly. In other words, the responsibility for widows falls first upon the children or the grandchildren in the house. And he even calls it as a return to their parents. You might say, you owe them something, and so you are responsible for taking care of them. It's the natural outgrowth of the care and nurture that they received in childhood. It's the natural return due amongst family. The natural reality is that a widow who has children or grandchildren should expect that they would be the first to step up and to take care of her. And by the way, you'll notice that Paul repeats it again all the way down in verse 16. He repeats it again, but he does it in reverse. In verse 16, he says, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her, that is the believing woman, care for them. Let not the church be burdened. So he repeats it, but in reverse. If you are someone who has a widow in your family, you have a responsibility, first and foremost, to take care of them. You will notice the bookends, because Paul repeats this at the beginning and then again at the end. The bookends suggest that this is the core qualification of his policy. The core qualification of his policy is this idea: widows, but not all widows. A certain subset of widows, and the primary qualification is going to be, do those women have already in their house someone who can support them? That's where he's going to be going here. But I would have you to notice that this qualification doesn't just stand by itself. Paul makes this statement because he has an underlying worldview. There's a worldview that undergirds this qualification. He's not picking this out of thin air. There's a reason why Paul says this, and we will come to that in a moment. In verses 5 and 6, then, what Paul does is contrast those, then, who are truly widows, according to this idea, this qualification, versus those who are not. Okay, so look what he says in verse 5. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, see it? Has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Verse 6, but she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Now, let me point out what Paul is really trying to say here. That sounds difficult, doesn't it? It's almost like Paul is saying, listen, if you're a widow and you have children or grandchildren, you're the self-indulgent one. Kind of what it looks like, but it's not really what he's saying. What Paul is doing, I think, here is simply trying to make a point. He's simply trying to make a point of where need is to be addressed. He's not intending to imply that all younger widows are basically selfish and self-focused, while all the older widows are pious and godly. I don't think that's what he's intending to do. I think what he's intending to do here is to establish a policy in which he says those who are truly in need, because they have no other option, versus those who have other options. There's two classes of these women in the church. Those who don't have any options because their husband is gone, they don't have any children or grandchildren to support them, they can be helped. But this other group over here, they have other options, and they should pursue those options. And by the way, when you get down to verses 9 and below, Paul's going to lay out what that means in terms of pursuing other options, okay? He's establishing a dividing line here so that the church has a firm policy built on a Christian worldview. He's making a dividing line to make sure that the church has a policy established on a Christian worldview. Now let me just pause here for a moment. Remember last week we talked about the fact that Paul is addressing conflict in the church, right? And this is a conflict. You have people who have need, and there's going to be a discussion, who gets it and who doesn't get it, right? That's going to could potentially produce conflict. I mean, that was the problem in Acts 6. There was conflict that arose, and so there's this reality in the church. So Paul says the same thing here that he says in speaking to Timothy about treating others as fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers. We are to address need by honoring the implicit value and importance of others as children of God. Again, the family relationship issue of verse 1 and 2 flows into the remaining verses of the chapter. Paul starts off by saying, listen, when you start dealing with these issues in the church, of dealing with people who need to be rebuked, or people who have physical needs, or later when he gets to elders in verse 17 and what they're doing, you need to think along the lines of family. You need to think along the lines of how do we approach this in terms of family. We honor one another as part of the children of God, and we are to seek help through humility. Let me remind you again that this flows out of the fifth commandment. Just like we talked last week, there's a flowing out of the fifth commandment here. Honor thy father and thy mother, as it's written in Exodus 20. Paul knows that this idea of honoring father and mother is integral to what it means to have the law written on the heart. When the Lord said, I will take out the heart of stone and I will put in a heart of flesh and I will write my law upon their heart. The regenerate is a person who possesses a heart, not just a heart that wants to love God, but a heart that loves the law of God. The law of God being honor thy parents, honor thy father and thy mother. Treat one another as family, Paul says. It's central to the fundamental nature of the nuclear family as God's good design. So the needs of the vulnerable should first be addressed by those designed by God to them. Honor thy father and thy mother. If your mother's a widow, you have a responsibility as part of the fifth commandment, which is written on your heart, to take care of that woman by honoring them. So Paul is expressing here nothing more than what the law itself would say to the regenerate person who says, yes, I love the law of God, and the law of God says, honor thy parents. So that's what I want to do in whatever way that I can. I know that there are some of you here who are in the business of taking care of your parents. And there are some of you who will be in that business in the not too distant future, taking care of your parents, dealing with the issues of aging. You know, one of the problems with modern medicine is that we now live a lot longer than we used to. And so we now have the real concrete issue of taking care of aged parents. Christians are to think about this as a noble task. As a noble task. To think of it as something in which we, as those who belong to Christ, are, yes, this is what I desire to do because this is what it is to obey the law of God, to love the law of God. Taking care of our aged parents is at the very heart of what it means to trust in God and to recognize how He thinks the world is to operate. The world around us tells us, just stick your parents off somewhere and forget about them. But not in the church. Not amongst those of us who belong to Christ. Our reaction is to say, these are the man and woman who, in this case woman, who brought me into this world, who raised me in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I have a responsibility to them. I'm going to honor the law in me. It should be at the very heart of what we are, because this is how God thinks. This is how God thinks. So when Paul writes these words, he's not writing some sort of policy statement in which he's saying, listen, let me just draw some rules here so that everybody knows what we ought to do. It's coming out of a worldview. It's coming out of a thinking process for the apostle. A woman who has children or grandchildren, those children or grandchildren, if they belong to the Lord, should want to be the first to step up and take care of their aging parents. Now in verses 9 to 15, Paul gives us the specifics in this policy. He gets more specific here. He gives us more qualifications of those who are to be included in the policy. So he's quite specific. He says, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she's brought up children, has shown hospitality, has watched the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. Okay, so he gives now a very concrete idea of those that the church should be stepping up to help. Now, he's already said what group that is, but now here he gets more specific. First, he says they should be over 60. Why 60? Because it is that these are unlikely to remarry, or they are simply too old to support themselves. The average age in the first century was far less than it is today. A woman in her 60s would have been today a woman in her mid-80s, even early 90s. So this is aged folks. So only those who are really unable to remarry and are too old to support themselves. Secondly, only those who have demonstrated fidelity to their husband. Okay, they are, as he says, the wife of one husband. They have been faithful to marriage vows. The phrase, the wife of one husband here, is very similar to the language that we saw back in chapter 3, verse 2, and chapter 3, verse 12, when both the elders and the deacons were said to have been husband of one wife. It's the same language, just in reverse. In this case, the wife of one husband. And you remember when we talked about this back at that time, we talked about elders and deacons being a one-woman man. Now, let me just point out, Paul could have used the word divorced here if he wanted to. He knew the word, he used it in other places, but he doesn't choose that word. Instead, he chooses a broader phrase to describe these folks here because he's not attempting, in either the elders, deacons, or widows, I think, to establish a strict boundary in relation to marriage because there's all kinds of circumstances that could produce relative problems in all those things. Rather, Paul uses a much broader statement. Does this person demonstrate in their most significant human relationship the concept of fidelity and reputation? Does this person demonstrate, has this woman demonstrated that when she was married to this man, that she had a fidelity to him and a reputation for being faithful? Does she have a reputation for being faithful in marriage? Does her marriage represent her commitment to Christ? Is what he's saying. That's what he's saying. So he limits benevolence to those whose marriages reflect a broader commitment to Christ. An older woman who's unlikely to remarry or unable to support herself, and demonstrated in the course of her marriage that she was indeed faithful to her husband as a picture of her faithfulness to Christ. Thirdly, only those who have a reputation for good works. Good works. Those committed to the Christian life. And the next few phrases, the next 5 phrases, are simply an explanation of what he means by good works. Has this woman brought up children? Now, pause. Not necessarily limiting benevolence, of course, to mothers. Because he's already said, has he not, those who have children or grandchildren don't apply. So you might almost assume that Paul means widows who never had kids. That's probably not what he means. He means simply that these were potentially women who, by virtue of their motherhood, also demonstrated their fidelity to Christ. They raised their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord as a part of the church. Secondly, they have shown hospitality. They've been welcoming and open to others. That qualification, you remember, is exactly the same for the elders back in 3:2, that they're to be hospitable. Okay? Not good party throwers, but those who have a sense of welcoming to their personality. Thirdly, they've washed the feet of the saints, demonstrated submission to others. Foot washing is a submissive thing. Jesus did it, you remember, in John 13 at the beginning of his Passover meal, the upper room discourse. And why did he do it? Because it demonstrated submission. He did it in order to show that his very work upon the cross was going to be the ultimate act of submission. And so he washes the feet of the saints as a demonstration of it. Same thing here. It's not necessarily the case that Paul thinks that these women should have been running around washing the feet of the saints every time they showed up at the church. That's not the point. The point is that they have demonstrated a sense of deep submission to others. Fourthly, they've cared for the afflicted. This seems to be, to me, the best one of the list because it was herself generous towards others. Who's deserving of help? Someone who's been helpful. Someone who's been generous. Someone who's helped the afflicted. And then finally, devoted herself to every good work. Simply a summary statement of having a reputation for serving others. They've earned this help. Paul says, those over 60, those who have demonstrated fidelity to their husband, and those who have a reputation for good works. So Paul includes in this policy only those who are truly qualified to receive help. Anybody can call and ask for help, right? So Paul says, let me make sure that we clarify clearly who this group is supposed to be. Assuming from the beginning that widows will be taken care of by their children or grandchildren. But we're probably going to have a subset of people who are not in that case, and so therefore let me make sure that we put the right qualifications on it, because the church is probably not likely to be able to meet the needs of every potential widow that would come along. Particularly now, starting in verse 11, those not to be included in the policy. So Paul doesn't just say those who belong, but he says those who do not belong, but refuse to enroll younger widows. For when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Now let me stop there for a moment. It almost looks, doesn't it, as Paul writes that he's looking down on younger widows and saying to them that if they desire to remarry, or it makes them seem like pagans fulfilling selfish desires to run off after a husband. Well, the problem with that is it would violate other understandings of the apostle in other places, particularly if you go to the book of Corinthians where Paul talks about marriage. He would seem to be violating his own thinking if you read this as it is. I don't think that's what it means. I think that what Paul is saying here in verses 11 and 12, that what he's equating desiring to marry with abandoning the faith or calling these younger women idle gossipers, is that more likely what Paul is attempting to do is directly address some women in the church at Ephesus who treat their widowhood as an opportunity for licentious living at the expense of the church. Going back to chapter 1, could it possibly be that one of the problems at the church at Ephesus is that there's a group of women who don't have husbands anymore, and they're living on the church's dole, and they're living their lives in some sort of way in which they're just going around with idle gossip and all these other kinds of things? It could very well be that what Paul was attempting to do here is say, listen, Timothy, one of the specific issues you're going to have to deal with are those women. They're a problem in the church. You need to deal with that. Is that not going to produce conflict? You betcha. But what did Paul say? Do your job. Okay. So he's saying, I don't think he's saying that every single younger widow that wants to go marry is in fact, abandoning the faith. Quite the opposite. He wants them to go and remarry. In fact, he says that a little later in verse 14, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. I think what he's doing here is suggesting that it is possible for the church to turn some younger widows into this state if they're not careful. It's very possible to enable some, by virtue of taking care of their needs, into the kind of character where they're not being what they ought to be in the church. That's why you have this strong encouragement in verse 14 for younger widows to marry. If they do, they can skirt, quote unquote, the problem of becoming dependent upon the entitlement of the church and the temptation thereby to live loosely. Because, hey, somebody else is paying the bill, so I can do what I want to do, right? Now just pause for a moment and ask yourself if that isn't true in an entitlement generation. When people find themselves being able to rely on others to pay the bills, what happens to their behavior? I mean, we have an entire culture built around an entitlement mentality, do we not? So what happens? We become licentious. So Paul is stepping back and go, this cannot be allowed to happen in the church. These younger women should not be enabled by virtue of the church supporting them to fall into the habit of becoming idle gossipers and lazy and these sorts of things. Don't put them on the dole, because once you put them on the dole, this is the problem. Rather, encourage them to remarry. Put them back into the world to go and find a husband to be supported. So Paul includes in the policy those who are truly qualified to receive help because they have certain characteristics that would lead them away from that kind of licentious thinking, and then he includes from his policy those who are able to seek support themselves. The church is not to be burdened by those who can support themselves. Notice the end of verse 16. Let the church not be burdened so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So that's all that Paul is doing here. He's simply establishing in his policy the fundamental qualification: those who have no other means of support. And then from there he steps down into, okay, we're going to classify those who can get support from the church because of their conditions versus those who cannot. So we're going to make it clear who belongs and who does not. And by establishing a policy such as this and allowing Timothy to enforce it in this way, you get rid of a great deal of conflict. It's one of the advantages that I have in having a benevolence policy as we have it written on the website. I can say to these who call, I'm sorry, we only provide benevolence monies to those who are a regular part of our church family. Makes it easier. Without such a policy, I'm left sort of hanging. What do I do? Do I give? Do I not give? How do I handle it? Paul gives a very clear case so that Timothy knows what he ought to do. But Paul says something in verse 7 that sounds familiar, or it ought to sound familiar to your ears. What does he say? Command these things as well. Now, the reason I say it should sound familiar to you is because it's exactly what he said back in 4:11. Command and teach these things. In other words, what Paul is saying here is that Timothy is to put these things at the forefront of the church and make sure everyone understands these matters. Everyone should understand this in terms of how we are to understand the concept of benevolence. Put into place principles and policies which reflect the generosity of the church, but hold fast within a Christian worldview. Command these things and teach them. You might be sitting there thinking to yourself, what in the world does this have to do with me? And that's a pretty legitimate question, actually. But that's exactly what Paul says to Timothy. Put these things in front of the church. We put 1 Timothy 5 before your eyes and ears so that you're thinking about issues such as benevolence and how we treat one another in the church and how we take care of one another. And do we just automatically take care of somebody because they have a need? Or do we pause and say, wait a minute, let's think about this in terms of the larger worldview of how we are generous. It's good to be generous, but be generous with wisdom, right? As Jesus himself said, be wise as scorpions, but as gentle as doves. Have a way of thinking through these matters. We're not called to just be generous because that's what we are. So anytime somebody says they have a need, just rush right to it and take care of it. There's thinking that should go on. We should be asking ourselves deeper questions about how we deal with this. But in verse 8, which you'll notice I skipped over, Paul gives the fundamental worldview that shapes his understanding of this policy. Let me read it to you. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now let's pause and reflect upon what Paul is addressing here. Providing for one's household is a fundamental tenet of a Christian worldview. Providing for one's own is a fundamental tenet of a Christian worldview. It is key to a Christian understanding because to think otherwise, Paul says, is to be worse than an unbeliever. How can you be worse than an unbeliever? I mean, if you're an unbeliever, isn't that bad enough? How can you be worse than an unbeliever? Is there anything worse than an unbeliever? Paul is being hyperbolic here. He's using strong language to make a point. There is nothing worse than being an unbeliever because the day that you stand before Christ, your unbelief will condemn you for all eternity, right? There's nothing worse than that. But he's using this kind of hyperbole in order to make a point. Such a person who thinks this way still thinks like the world. Still thinks like the world, still holds the world's viewpoint. Paul repeats this belief, by the way, in a couple of other places in his writings. It's not the only place where Paul says this. He says it again in 2 Thessalonians 3, starting in verse 10. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busy bodies. Now, such persons we command and encourage in the Lord Jesus Christ to do the work quietly and to earn their own living. So Paul has an underlying idea that we are to be working, we are to be supporting our households. He says it again in Ephesians 4:28 in this way, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Paul's position is that a fundamental reality, a fundamental part of a Christian worldview, to not think like the world, to not be worse than an unbeliever, is to think, how do I support myself and my family? Providing for one's own household is for the Apostle Paul a key element of the Christian idea of work. The Christian idea of work. The basic underlying theological position that Paul holds here goes all the way back to Adam and something which we in Reformed circles call the covenant of works. If you've been with us in our Wednesday night theological study, we've been talking about this. If not, I'll let you know what I'm talking about. The covenant of works. Adam was created to work. Adam was created to work. Now, I know what you're thinking. The first thing that comes to your mind is, that's right, he was created to work the garden. And yes, indeed, he was. He was put into the garden. God put him there, as in Genesis 2:15, to work the garden. But, that's not the primary work of Adam. Oh, it is a work. It's not the primary work. The primary work that Adam was to do was the work of Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Be fruitful and multiply and take dominion over all things. That's the work that Adam was put to do. God had created this creature and put him to work out his dominion over everything. Adam was to do the work of using all that God had formed to work out the imago Dei, the image of God in himself. God had given to Adam a whole world that was good. Everything in it was perfect. And then he formed this creature and breathed into him and said, I've given to you all of my God-like attributes, the image of God. I've given you intelligence. I've given you language. I've given you will and emotion. I've given you creativity. I've given you all this stuff. Use it. Use it. Use all of this that I have created, all of these trees and all of these animals and all of this stuff that I have filled the earth with. Use it. Work. Take dominion over everything. Learn about things. Be creative with them. Be inventive. Adam was to use creation as a tool to advance himself as a creature in control of all this stuff. And we do. Don't we? I've said this before, I'll say it again. I'm always flabbergasted when I walk into Walmart at how much stuff human beings have thought up and built and shipped that I can buy and put in my house. This is what we do. We're inventive. We have an ability. God gave it to us. Adam, use your creativity, your knowledge, your understanding, and go do the work. You might say that Adam's primary job in this work was to learn about his Creator by examining and using all that had been given to him, and then to glorify God with the results. Take everything that God had created, learn about this Creator through what God had created, and then use what was created to glorify this Creator. Imagine what this world would be like if we had not fallen into sin. And all of the things that we could create and learn about our Creator that would turn about and glorify this God. Adam was to be productive. Adam wasn't just supposed to sit under the tree of life and eat as the apples fell, or whatever fruit it was, from the tree into his lap, and just sit there and be idle. No, he was to be busy. He was to be doing things. He was to be out there enjoying the creation that God had given to him. He was to be productive. Now, unfortunately, when he fell, this productivity, this productiveness would be seriously hampered. And God said to Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. No longer will it produce everything that you want. You got to toil at it now. Now you got to work hard. Now you got to beads of sweat will have to come out of your forehead in order for you to get what you need. And you're going to have to strive in order to survive, and you will eventually work yourself into a grave. You will eventually work yourself to death. As I said on Wednesday night, that is the essence of work in our day. The 6 days that you do work during the week, that is work that leads to death. This is the work that leads to life. he was to work, but that productivity was cut off. But that doesn't mean the productivity was the end. That means the productivity was just going to be a lot harder. But like everything else, and this is where we turn this, okay, where Paul is understanding all this. Like everything else, through the church, the work of Christ is established to redeem everything, including the work of human beings. You understand this? As a Christian, when you work, you are not just toiling. You are doing a redeemed activity because you are thinking. As a one who belongs to this Christ, he is redeeming all things, and we are working not just as toil, but as vocation designed to glorify God as we support ourselves. That's how we're supposed to look at work. Not just get up Monday morning, put on our clothes, grab some coffee, go to work, and suffer through another day and go home. How many of you feel like that? I do. Every Monday, I got to start all over again. But you know what? There's a different way to view it. And the different way to view it is to know that this work, even though it's toilsome, has been redeemed by Christ as a vocation. Have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus spent the first 30 years of his life as a carpenter working? Have you ever thought about that? Why did he do that? Why did the Son of God, the eternal Son of God, come down from his Father's side, be born to a virgin, and then spend 30 obscure years just working with stone and wood and whatever else carpenters worked with? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Could it be that the Son of God was working because he understood what work was supposed to be? He understood that he had created Adam, the first Adam, of which he was the last Adam. And so he would work, he would toil, but he would not toil as someone toiling to an end that would kill him, but rather toiling to demonstrate to us, listen, this is what God created us to be. And Jesus walks out from his carpenter shop, from his Father's carpenter shop, at a certain point and goes to a cross and says, all of that is now redeemed. And at some point in the future, when my kingdom is finally consummated upon this earth, all of those who belong to me, they will work. Oh, but they will work in the way that I originally intended before the fall. When work will no longer be toil, but work will be joy. Work will be creative and inventive. I have a book on my shelf by a man by the name of Randy Alcorn. It's a simple title, Heaven. And in this book, it's a picture of heaven, very different from what most evangelical Christians have in regards to heaven, but basically argues, imagine what this world will be like when Jesus finally redeems all things and you and I put together all of our creativity and our giftedness and our talents and use all that God has created on this earth and every other star in the universe. Imagine what we can do. Today we can barely get to the moon. Imagine what will happen when we are finally freed from the bonds of the fall to use the massive intelligence that God will grant us to have again, to use the things of this world to do who knows what. It's being redeemed. You see? There's an idea of work that's a part of the Christian gospel, that's a part of the message of Jesus Christ. And by the way, just as an aside, I know there are some of you here that are retired from secular work, but that doesn't mean that you're not still to work. There's work to be done. As long as we have breath in our souls, or bodies, we don't have breath in our souls, do we? As long as we have breath in our bodies, we are to be working. You may not be working for a secular company, but there's work to be done for the kingdom of God. A Christian worldview sees work as a redeemed aspect of what it means to follow Jesus. Our benevolence is built around our understanding of work. Paul's understanding of these widows is if they can take care of themselves, if they have family to support themselves, then they should, because that's what a Christian worldview regarding work looks like. We work because we understand its significance to redemption. This worldview is what undergirds this widow's list that Paul builds here. Those widows who have family or opportunity to support them must choose that route. Only those without those options should seek help from the generosity of the church. Our first question we should always be asking ourselves is, what will I do to support myself? And as husbands and fathers, we should be asking, what will I do to support my wife and kids? And as Christians, we should be asking, what will I do to support my aging parents? It's all part of a larger picture, this idea of work that God has established in His creation. And if we understand that redemption includes everything upon this earth, we understand this picture of even work itself being a part of our existence. There's no room in a Christian worldview, as Paul said earlier when I read from 1 Thessalonians, there's no room for idleness or busybody. We have work to do. We are to be generous, yes. We are to be generous. We are to look for opportunities to help people where we can, but we should not allow our generosity to override our understanding of what it means to work, to support what needs to be supported. Be generous, but be quick to support. Be quick to ask, how can we help? Too many in our society, unfortunately today, believe that you can be generous without any viewpoint of work, which is one of the reasons why people call the church looking for a handout. They just want money. They're not interested in working. They would never come to the church to support the church in that. And while we might choose to be generous to them, it would be better for us to say to them, listen, can you support yourself? Do you have the opportunity and power to get a job and earn a living? Some will say, yes, I have a job, but it doesn't quite support us. Then fine, we'll consider that as a part of the picture, but we have a Christian worldview here that undergirds what we do. We need to think along those lines. We need to be generous, yes, but we need to be wise in our generosity. That's what Paul's arguing in the widow's list. Treat the widows appropriately, and don't give the devil a foothold in the way that you think.